Israeli journalist Amir Haas, who for 30 years has been reporting from the West Bank. And Amira said in the aftermath of the October 7th events, and I'm going to quote from her article now, in a few days, she wrote, Israelis went through what Palestinians have experienced as a matter of routine for decades and are still experiencing: military incursions, death, cruelty, slain children, bodies piled up on the road, siege, fear, anxiety over loved ones, captivity, and searing humiliation. And so history did not begin on October the 7th. And nothing I'm going to say here today or ever say will justify what happened on October the 7th, because that's not justifiable. And I don't know anybody who says that it is. At the same time, if our intention is to move forward, to create some basis for peace, we have to be able to understand the experience of the other. And the experience of the other for the last 80 years, and this is simply historical fact, has been mass killings. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed. Thousands of children have been killed. This is going back to 1947, 48. People have been expelled from their land. They've been occupied. Yes, there are 220 or so Israeli hostages, for which one can only express regret and pray for their safety. Thousands of Palestinians are held hostage in Israeli jails and tortured, professionally tortured. And last year I was in the occupied territories working with women who had been tortured in Israeli jails. So without going through the long history, I will only tell you that we have to ask ourselves, what fed such hatred, such desire for revenge on the part of those people that broke out of Gaza? And Gaza has been called the largest concentration camp in the world by an Israeli sociologist, Baruch Kimmerling. And I can only stop here and say, I'm not going to go into the history now. I will do this in other forums. I did a long interview a couple of days ago that will be online soon. I'll be doing an online question answer period with the organization SAND, Spirituality and Non-Duality, next week sometime. But in the meanwhile, people do need to understand that, horrible as those events are, and nothing I'm saying again, I repeat, justifies it, at the same time, it did not begin on October the 7th. And there is information that people owe it to themselves to discover, is information from Israeli and Palestinian sources. May I mention some of them now?
Please.
Yeah. In terms of Israeli histories, begin with this book called The Birth of Israel, Myths and Realities by Simha Flapan. Simha Flapan was a lifelong kibbutz member. He was a Zionist. He fought in the 48 war. He was the head of the Mapam party's Arab affairs branch. And long ago, he wrote this book where he pointed out that the things that many people believe about the birth of Israel was not the way it happened, that the 47-48 war was not the way it's presented in the official Israeli and pro-Zionist histories. You can begin with Simha Flapan. Then there's the modern Israeli historian Ilan Pappé. He's got a book called A History of Modern Palestine. You could check that out. As a Palestinian source for Palestinian history, you could read Rashid Khalidi's The 100 Years' War against 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism. Wonderful book. Very objective and in no way anti-Jewish. You can read Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, that describes what really happened in 1907, 1948. You can read the magnificent Norman Finkelstein's book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, published in 2018. You can watch Norman Finkelstein's interviews with Chris Hedges in the last couple of weeks. You can watch Norman Finkelstein interview with Michaela Peterson just in
Michaela
the last couple
Peterson.
of days um, on YouTube. Again, a succinct, learned, very measured account of the history of Gaza, which, as I may have mentioned before, the Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmerling has called the world's largest concentration camp. These people that committed the atrocities on October the 7th were born and grew up in the world's largest concentration camps where repeatedly they've been massacred and deprived and oppressed. And none of this justifies it again. But I'm telling you, if we're going to move forward on this, we have to be able to understand not just our own emotional reactions, but also the emotions and the circumstances that fuel those emotions of the other side. There are people that hate Jews just because they're Jews, not because of what Jews did or didn't do, but just because they're Jews. Just as there are people who hate blacks, not because of what blacks did or didn't do. There are people who hate Muslims, not because of Muslims who did or didn't do. And these people will take any Jewish action or any black action or any Muslim action that can be criticized, and they will use it as fuel for the hatred that they already harbor within themselves. And Jews have been subject to that kind of anti-Semitism for a long time, where the anti-Jewish feelings had nothing to do with anything that Jews did. And there's a history of this going back many hundreds of years and even longer, actually. And that culminated in the most horrible event in history, which is the mechanized, scientifically planned, organized attempt to eliminate a whole people, of which my grandparents were victims, and of which I myself, as an infant, almost was a victim as well. There are some people like that, and they use any criticism of Israel as a fuel for their already embedded anti-Jewish sentiments. That's not what I see for the most part. For the most part, that I see that the people that criticize Israel do so with a lot of pain in their hearts. They actually want justice, and they want justice for everybody. And they criticize Israel not because it's Jewish, but because of what it does. And what it does has been called recently by 2,000 Israeli and Jewish academics and rabbis and historians apartheid. What it does has been called by the former deputy chief of the Israel Defense Staff similar to the situation of Jews in Nazi Germany. This is an Israeli soldier who said that, not an anti-Semite. And he said that just as the Nazi thugs could attack Jews with the impunity and even with the support of the police, so can settlers in the occupied territories attack, kill, destroy Palestinian property, murder even children. And when the Palestinians fight back, the army shows up to support the settlers. And this was said by a former deputy head of the Israel Defense Forces. So that a lot of people who are not in the least racist, one way or the other, have genuinely come to rue and lament and oppose the actions of the Israeli state. And as a Jew, I'm one of them. And when a Jew speaks up, now if you're a pro-Zionist who fully believes that Jewishness is identifiable with Zionism in Israel, then naturally you'll think that anybody who criticizes Israel is either an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. But that perception is a product of your belief that Jewishness is identified with Israel. Whereas if you look at it historically, there were many Jews all along who criticized the Zionist movement and who pointed out the potential dangers and who warned what's going to happen.
And I might add that there are Israelis who are now protesting in the streets what Israel is doing in Gaza.
Exactly. And there were 500 Jews that were arrested in Washington a few days ago for
And,
protesting.
and last night, many, many Jews gathered in Grand Central Station in New York. And the New York Times did a story on it, which is pretty remarkable to see.
And so, look, to sum this up, it's such a painful situation. And I mean, such suffering. And recently, Israel has suffered in a way that it hasn't suffered before. And that's to be lamented. And the people there need to be supported because they're having a hard time. There are many Israeli homeless right now because of the threats. And I know from Israeli friends of mine that Israeli mental health services are overwhelmed. That is true. It also has to be acknowledged. When it comes to the scale of suffering imposed by one party on the other, there's barely any comparison. Historically speaking, the number of deaths, the imprisonments, the suffering, the deprivation has been the prerogative of the stronger party. I'm not speaking morally here. I'm speaking practically. I'm not saying to justify anything. I'm saying, do we want to move forward to peace? Or do you just want to harbor our emotions? We're entitled to our emotions, but when we're emotional and only emotional, our perspective narrows. It becomes defensive, and we get consumed by self-defense and attack. Understandable. That doesn't lead to peace. What leads to peace is a willingness to understand the experience of the other and for us to be guided by the parts of our brain that are adult. And that happens in the midfrontal cortex, where empathy, insight, compassion, self-awareness are modulated. So we need to deal with our emotions, not to repress them, not to reject them, but also not let them be the guides of our actions, especially when these emotions are conditioned by a view of history that for the most part excludes the experience of the other. Just as I said that October the 7th was unjustifiable, so has everything that happened since then unjustifiable. What Israel is doing right now in Gaza has been called by Israeli scholars and Jewish scholars genocide by any definition. Uh, I don't like using that word. Actually, I don't even agree with it because I want to reserve genocide when somebody decides to eliminate physically another people. And that happened to the Jews in Europe. What happens, right? But by international definition of genocide, I'm not talking about my own personal definition, but by international definition of genocide, what is happening right now is genocide. That's simply how it is.
What is the difference?
And,
What is the difference? Because I'm not sure I quite understand what you mean.
and any large attack that kills a large number of civilians, moves them out of their place, puts them under danger, by and large is considered genocide.
I see.
So, without getting into the debate about what genocide actually is, let's not even use the word. What's happening is a massive war crime. And just as the events of October the 7th are not justifiable by anything that Israel did before, although it's explainable, it's not justifiable. The two are not the same thing. At the same time, what Israel is doing right now is not in any way justifiable. It's not a response to what just happened. It's what Israel has always done when there was much less provocation. The killing of large number of Palestinians. 20,000 civilians died in 1982 in the Lebanese war. Tens of thousands were killed in 1947-48, civilians, deliberately. These are not questionable historical facts. So what's going on right now is not